Today is Wednesday, February 28th, 2018, and I call this meeting to order. The first order of business is the approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion?
So moved.
Move. Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Hearing, seeing none. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next order of business is the approval of the minutes from our February 14th meeting. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. At this point in the meeting, members of the public who wish to address the council on matters not on the agenda may do so. Do we have anyone signed up? We don't have anyone signed up. Is there anyone who would like to address the council? Seeing no one, we'll move on to the consent agenda. The next order of business is to approve the consent agenda. Can I have a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Moved
Second.
and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. We'll move now to the reports of the standing committees. Community Development is first. Councilmember Commerce.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The committee has one item to recommend for consideration by the full council. That's item 2018-44, a land acquisition for affordable new development loan forgiveness for the city of St. Paul. A little bit of background, Madam Chair. The council initiated the land loan program in 2008, and the program provided zero-interest loan financing to help livable communities, ACT communities, acquire land for future projects in order to advance affordable housing needs. The council made $4 million available for the initiative on a one-time basis at that time, and awarded 5 loans between 2008 and 2011. The combination of communities' reluctance to borrow and complications of loan and property holding issues led to limited interest from participating communities. So, as a result, the council discontinued offering land loans in 2012. At that time, the council authorized staff to negotiate the loans to be forgivable if the community could produce a project consistent with the original intent of the program. So, in 2008, St. Paul received a loan for $1 million for the Saxon Ford site, which is the focus of this business item. It's 5 parcels between University and Sherburne Avenues. And after considerable effort and a lot of neighborhood input, the city has now attracted an assisted living developer with a project for this site. So the proposed action is that the council approve the city's request to forgive the $1 million land acquisition for affordable new development land loan for the city's proposed assisted living project there, and to authorize our community development director to execute amended loan forgiveness agreements for the project.
Thank you, Member Commerce. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next committee is the Transportation Committee. Councilmember Schreiber.
Yes, thank you. Madam Chair, members, business item 2018-37 deals with the Unified Planning Work Plan. Every year, this plan is recommended through the TAC and TAB committees before adoption by the Council, MnDOT, and the Federal Highway Administration. It establishes activities that will use federal planning funds for the coming year. Since this plan is written 6 months before the year begins, work items emerge during the year were not anticipated in the beginning. It has become clear that the system-to-system interchange study was a high priority for the region. Originally planned for 2019, staff from the Metropolitan Council and MnDOT see value in moving ahead by 1 year. I therefore move, Madam Chair, that the Metropolitan Council amend the 2018 Unified Planning Work Program to include the system-to-system interchange study.
Thank you, Member Schreiber. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. Councilmember Schreiber.
Madam Chair, members, business item 2018-40 deals with the regional solicitation package. The regional solicitation for federal transportation project funding process is a part of the Metropolitan Council's federally required continuing comprehensive and cooperative transportation planning process for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. TAB develops and issues a regional solicitation for federal funding that is intended to implement regional policy and address regional and local transportation needs. I would therefore move, Madam Chair, that the Metropolitan Council concur with the Transportation Advisory Board action to approve the attached regional solicitation package for 2020-2021 funding for TDM projects and to release the solicitation.
Thank you, Member Schreiber. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next item, Councilmember Schreiber.
Madam Chair, members, business item 2018-43 deals with the Mall of America Transit Station renovation project. All three bids recently received were greater for the construction project construction budget amount of $22 million. Staff recommends rejecting bids to allow for updating the bid documents to include scope reduction and material modifications. The project will be reissued in March 2018. I would therefore move, Madam Chair, that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to reject all bids received for contract 17P-185 Mall of America Transit Station renovations project.
Thank you, Member Schreiber. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion on this item?
Just a comment, Chair. Not specifically on this project, but projects in general. There's a group going to meet next week to talk about with the industry stakeholders and Metro Transit staff, just to talk about how we might be able to look at projects a little bit different into the future, so this event isn't as often reoccurring that we've seen lately. So hopefully we're going to have some decent conversations about it.
Great. Thank you, Member Millander. Any other comments? I think this will give us the opportunity to revise the bids and get them back out on the street relatively quickly so we can move forward with the project. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. Next item on the agenda is item 2018-46, council member committee assignments. You have the item in front of you. Could I have a motion to adopt?
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on this item? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next item is 2018-55, appointment of council officers. To reappoint Councilmember Millander to be vice chair. Can I have a motion to approve?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Any
know about
discussion
that.
on this item?
We should refer that to some other committee.
Speak now. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next item on the agenda is an information item that we have on the Metro Mobility Task Force. Excited to welcome Nick Thompson and Christine Kennan to give us an update on the task force. Thank you.
Madam
Welcome.
Chair, members, thank you for letting us give you an update on this task force today. It's our second update of the day. We just presented in a longer version to the legislature today, as this was a task force that they initiated. And so we'll give an update. I will go through the findings of the task force, and then Christine, as the senior manager in charge of Metro Mobility, will also talk about all the other changes that are underway in Metro Mobility that we have initiated outside of the task force process. So you will notice on your chair also a map, and this was intended to be in the presentation. It is sort of important for the recommendations, so I handed that out. I encourage you to refer to it as we talk about two different areas
Madam Chair.
tonight.
Please. All
So-
right. Sorry, just one second. Member Reynoso?
Nick, could you possibly kind of preface the report as to what the legislature language specifically intended, or what the thought process is on what the intent is, should I say?
Madam Chair, members, I will. We have a couple slides that kind of get into the details of that, so I'll go through that.
Thank you.
So it was established in 2017 in the legislative session with three goals: identify the options and methods to increase program effectiveness and efficiency of Metro Mobility, minimize program costs, and improve the service, including seek potential partnerships with taxis and TNCs, transportation network companies, and specifically in Minnesota, there are 2 TNCs, Uber and Lyft. This task force was born, Metro Mobility got a lot of attention last legislative session for a few different reasons. We had some service issues that got a lot of media on, and we had a couple presentations about some service problems. And then our budget, with the increasing cost of Metro Mobility, we had several hearings on Metro Mobility, and from that, the task force was born with trying to find ways to make the program more efficient and expand the services. So that's a few of the origins of that. And the next slide gets even more detail about the specific requirements of the task force. The legislature established who would be on the task force. They identified 18 different member organizations or industry, and that they, of course, provided us no money to do the task force, but they asked that Met Council staff that. Council member Barber, who is not with us tonight, she was a co-chair, but Met Council was not a voting member. So of the 18 members, we'll show there's some were voting and some were non-voting. We had 7 meetings beginning in August. They met monthly, completed in February, but then we did eventually have working groups that met more frequently to produce the products. So the task force members, as listed here, there's a few different areas. Each of the 7 counties was asked to provide a member. 6 of the 7 counties nominated a county commissioner, and then in Dakota County, they delegated down to West St. Paul City Council member, who happened to have a daughter who was a user of Metro Mobility. So that was up to their discretion to pick which members would be on that. We had Minnesota Council on Disabilities, Department of Human Services. The industry-wide, there was taxi and the TNCs. They got up to 3, or the first 3 that volunteered were members. And so we had an open application process for those. The task force, they had specific requirements. Number 1 was describe the program in fairly good detail about how the program is organized, what some of its limitations are. And really, we spent probably the first 3 of the meetings describing the requirements of Metro Mobility, how it works, so that the task force could then go forward and find other recommendations that were within the boundaries of what could be allowed on a service like this. They required to report their findings, improve options, recommendations for expanded options. Specifically, the report said there had to be at least 3 new service models that involved transportation network companies and taxis. The task force did recommend 4 in the end, and we'll talk about those. And then any program and legislative changes that would be recommended, that would be necessary, they made that some recommendations there, and a requirement due by February 15th. I would say for the members of the task force, most of them walked into that task force with very little knowledge about the ins and outs of Metro Mobility, and this was a very aggressive timeline. And they all said that some of these recommendations would need further study, as you'll see, but at the end, I think they felt that they had enough knowledge to make good recommendations. So what was driving the part of the creation of the task force, and what we've been thinking about a lot, is this growth in Metro Mobility in both cost and ridership. It has been growing, 6 to 9%. And for every rider you add to the service, you add the cost of a trip. It's just the costs and the ridership go hand in hand. Last year, though, we seemed to flatten out a little. We had a 1% growth, which is after several years of larger growth. That was a little bit unusual. We attribute it to a few things. Number 1, we were having a hard time getting drivers, and Christine will talk about some of the impacts of a driver. We implemented the driver wage, or you passed the driver wage increase on October 1st to deal with that, and I think we're now getting better service out on the street, and we're seeing more ridership come back. Since the driver wage was increased, we've had ridership growth of 5% for the last quarter of 2017, and the first 6 weeks of 2018, we've had over 9% growth. So last year, we were watching it closely, but that 1% growth is not something we would expect in the future. We expect continued growth. You see the cost on this chart. You see the cost diverge, and that's really that adding that wage increase, which was necessary, really jumped our costs up too. So the minimum wage for drivers went from $14 to $16 starting.
Nick, could you just repeat the ridership growth? one more time? I
Yep.
think I
So
missed
in 2017, we ended the full year at 1% growth over 2016. But then when you break it down finer, the last quarter, which is the fourth quarter, even though that's when we increased the fares, that's also when we had the driver wage increase. So we started to retain drivers, have more drivers, attract more drivers, that we had 5% growth in that last quarter. So we were actually down in ridership prior to that. And then since January 1st, we've had about 9.5 to 10% growth,
Okay.
including on February 14th, the highest ridership day of all time, which was 1,000 more riders in a single day than we had ever had. And so we're definitely watching this closely because of the budget implications, but also making sure we have enough service available. So I think the task force report is timely and that we need to think about this growth and provide new options.
Was there a single event on the 14th?
Three things we think. It was the first
Besides-
warm day in a long time. It was the first day of Lent, a lot of church trips, and then it was Valentine's Day. Metro customers must travel a lot on Valentine's Day.
Great.
This is the trifecta that probably hasn't occurred before. Though we have this large cost per trip of 23 to 26 per rider, if you compare us to our peers, this is the task force saw a lot of information about how our service compares to our peers. We're a very efficient service compared to the peers. This is 2015 subsidy numbers from a consultant report that we have done. That we set up peers that had basically similar services, in many cases, same size cities, but you see a few larger cities here. We consider those peers because of their service model is similar to ours. So we're on the very low end of the cost per trip. In this case, we also highlight Boston. Boston is the yellow bar. Boston is highlighted because they have implemented transportation network companies in their paratransit service, and a lot of their findings were presented to the task force, and so we wanted to highlight where they're seeing savings in cost per trip in Boston, but they started at a much higher cost than we are. So we do not expect the difference between what we provide in a taxi and TNC service to be as big a range as they were in Boston.
Can I just ask a question about this in terms of how we compare as well? Did the task force find any insight into why we had lower rates than some of our peer regions?
Well, Madam Chair,
Besides
members, we think we're better, but no. We have implemented service models with our zones. We have we get very competitive prices. We have really good technology for routing. I think by the way we contract services and provide but buy the fleet competitive. There's a series of things and some of our policies that allow us to. And maybe Christine has some comments too.
And we do have the alternative service model of the taxi provision, and other cities don't have and are just implementing.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Please,
So-
Member Dorfman.
are the fares factored into this chart too?
Madam
No.
Chair, members, this is the subsidy after fares are
Is
taken
it
out.
after fares?
This is our highest cost service of our transit services that we provide. That what Dial Ride typically is too. So the task force broke into three different groups. They broke into a cost group, a customer needs group, and an industry group, chaired by task force members and supported by our staff. And it's each of those that there's extensive findings about the various elements within theirs, and then they would get together and make their recommendations based on their finding. We have now very good cost data about where our cost drivers are, and then we really tried to set it up so it'd be as apples to apples comparison as we could in the services, because, for example, when we provide a trip on a shared ride service, the federal FTA reimburses us $4.70. But if that same ride was to occur on a taxi where it's not shared, there isn't a reimbursement. So we wanted to make sure that everything was compared so that the decisions made by the task force were really looking at the full cost. And then the industry was chaired by taxis, but they really talked about what they could provide, and that all that wanted to provide expertise on that, and our current providers contributed to that discussion too. And some of the members of that industry group obviously had national experience that they could bring to the discussion. So these are the services, and that were proposed, as required, they needed to provide 3 services. In the sense, they ended up with 4. And I want to kind of break down how this breaks down through. So there's the base services, what we have today. The task force overwhelmingly said that base service needs to continue. It is the core of whatever our recommendations are. Our services that we are recommending are just additions to the base service. There is absolutely no changes, or we do not see that you could reduce or change that service. Those are a core service that needs to continue and will continue to be that. Then they kind of split into 2 different model options. Number 1 was shared ride services, and the second one was premium services. Premium options are one where it's a direct ride, like if any of us were to call and reserve an Uber or a taxi, that's what we consider premium. We currently have a taxi service in our model, and we call that premium same day. So it uses the same terminology. So we had base service, shared service, premium service, and then in the shared and the premium, they broke each of those into 2 elements. One is from STS providers, special transportation service providers, and the other is from the non-STS, which is where all of the TNCs fall and the taxis fall for sure, and they maybe or may not be STS. STS basically has a higher requirement for background checks, for driver training, certification for vehicles. It's a certification that's been administered in our state for a long time. It's services that are currently provided. So the key differences there was really the task force talked a lot about the training, background checks, really managing the risks in the vehicle types, and that's why they felt that both in shared and premium, they needed to offer both. They needed to recommend both of those options. The trick with the shared option is that it doesn't exist for TNCs and taxis in our market. In other cities, there are products called Uber Pool, Lyft Line, where you can do a shared ride in a TNC. Both Uber and Lyft were members of the task force, and they said they do not provide that product in our market, and they would not commit to providing it as part of the task force, nor say when they are. So the task force recommendation for the shared ride on those was basically, if they ever come to this market, please consider that as one of your service model options. And so we'll see if that is available.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So even if they did, though, provide some of the shared or pooled services, that would still be curb to curb, or do they also provide door through door in other markets?
Madam Chair, members, they do not. They would basically committed to curb
Okay.
in those, and both the pooled and the non. So that's where you start to see that these options are not available to all our customers in Metro Mobility, and that's a concern that we have. But that's one of the cost drivers too. And so, but there are many of our customers that could do curb to curb at least some of their time, and they do today through the taxi service. So it's an option that we felt was viable. But then the other issues become driver training. There was no commitment to increase their driver background checks or training beyond what they currently do. So we'll talk a little bit about risks coming up, but basically we'd have different levels of driver certification in the system if this was fully implemented, and that's a concern that we would definitely want to think through.
Madam Chair.
Member Reynoso.
Thank you. Nick, to the extent, I know you may cover this somewhere down the line, but I'm also concerned about liability, and specifically insurance that's required by TNCs versus taxis, and liability if they were to get into an accident. Where would that liability shift to? The carrier, or would it shift back to us?
Madam Chair, Councilmember, it would be the carrier's responsibility. It is for example, it is in the taxi service that we have today, it is the taxi responsibility. And even in our Metro Mobility service, it's the provider's responsibility to meet insurance and coverage requirements that we put in the contract. But it would not be a responsibility of the council. No, we also do not have agreements on these, right. So it'd be something that maybe in more detail as we get down, something that can be negotiated too. But
Go ahead, Member.
Two things that worrying me is, one, the coverage, the amount of liability that they would be required to carry, and the other is reputation. Look, whether it's a taxi driver or Uber driver or whatever it is, if it's a bad experience for that customer, we're going to bear the responsibility of reputation. So that's also something that concerns me. So.
Madam Chair, Council Member, yeah, I'll get to that in a risk, but that is definitely a point that the task force talked about. And as you see, part of this is that this would have to be services, the extended service that the customer opts into. And so the opt-in is probably key to part of that. Though it's our reputation. They're not opting into our reputation. So it doesn't mean they can not, if the service is poor, they can, raise that issue with us. And that's, if we were to implement that, I could think that is clearly a risk. Though we do have taxi services today. We've had it for 15 years. And so it's a risk I believe we've managed through that service. And we look to learn from our lessons from that, see if we're expanded, how would we protect our reputation there through management, oversight where we can.
Member Reynoso.
So Nick, do we require the taxi drivers or the taxi company that we use right now, do we require a fingerprint background check?
They are required to adhere to it's called the MNET study, and it does require a fingerprinting background check.
So now what I've heard from TNC, specifically Uber and Lyft, is that they will not comply with fingerprint background checks.
Madam Chairman, Council Member, yes, they stated that in the task force. They stated they would continue their background checks as they currently provide them, both in the state and around the country, unless they were required by some law or I believe they specifically stated they would not enter an agreement with us if that was part of it. They wouldn't change their business model.
Okay, thank you.
So I'll talk a little bit now about the advantages we see the task force saw. It's important for me to keep saying the task force because this is their report. This is not our report, the council's report. This is, though we helped the task force with information, is their recommendations. They talked about advantages, and then I'll talk next about risks. Number one is that growth. They looked at that cost growth and ridership growth and knew that it's funded through the state general fund, and they saw that as a risk. And they saw that as maybe providing more options. We could mitigate some of that risk of growth in the system and continue to provide service. That chart that I showed earlier was, the operating budget, but as that grow, we add 60 to 70 Metro Mobility buses to the fleet every year. That gets larger and larger, and so if you project that out 10, 15 years, the number of buses will be quite large, and we'd have to start thinking about our capital capacity too. They, because we have STS in the state, and then we'd have this non-STS, they said that there's advantages that if we could get down to the customer level, we can match customers with the right type of service by having a suite of services. The premium service, of course, is desired by the customers. Some of these trips on Metro Mobility, they're shared rides. They can be long rides in order to meet pickup times and so a premium trip is point to point. There's a lot of time advantages that customers would have. We know that. That's obvious. We see that with our taxi service too. But there's a cost to that too. The STS options were clear that is needed for some of our customers for the vehicles they have, the training of the drivers, the ability to go door through door if needed. So they felt that absolutely had to have an STS option in there. And there's pretty clear that on comparing trips of one of these services to Metro Mobility for the same length trip, it could be cheaper. It would be cheaper. We expect it would be cheaper. But there's a lot of caution in that too, because there's evidence in the other cities that have done that. So when you implement these services, those same customers take more trips than they would without those services. So on a trip basis, they might be cheaper, but the overall budget may go up or it may be impacted in a negative way because the more trips will be made. And so that's something they definitely were anticipated as an issue, and that they have some recommendations on how to implement or to mitigate that risk. The risks that the task force talked about, number one is this becomes a lot more complicated system for our customers. Many of the customers, the complexity would be a problem. Even our service today is too complex for some of the customers. And so we would worry about that. I think that we'd really have to be careful how we design this, and you'll see in a couple recommendations about how, if we were to fully implement all these recommendations, how we'd have to be careful about how we make sure customers understand it and the customer doesn't get placed on the wrong service in one of these service options. This change from curb to curb to door through door, there's many customers that could not handle, that just would not work for them. And it introduces some confusion, though there's some great time savings in that. It just won't work for a lot of customers. And many of our customers, especially mobility devices, do need assistance. The safety and concern, and really the reputational concern, was a risk they identified. On every trip today on a Metro Mobility bus, we have cameras. We record everything. We can go back and look at it whenever we want. If we see an issue, if a customer complains, we can investigate that. The contractor is a contractor of ours. So if there's an issue, discipline, or other actions can be taken, we have full investigative control over those trips. We would be giving up some of that because it would be basically the customer would be opting into these other providers, and it would be whatever they manage. They would not share. We wouldn't expect that they would share their video, if they have it, or audio with us in cases necessarily. So that's a risk. And it's a daily occurrence that we investigate trips or video or an audio or calls because of a complaint. So,
Member Dorfman.
Do you know, have we always had audio, video capabilities on Metro Mobility, or was that added at some point?
I assume it would have been added at around the time that the rest of the system was getting it. I don't know what year that was, but we've had it for a number of years. Similar to a Metro Transit system.
I'm trying to remember, and it's gotten better even as we've added it. It's gotten better and better. More cameras, better able to retrieve it, store video for longer, and so our ability to use it has improved dramatically over time, even since we've had it.
And Madam Chair, for my, and I think you may have said this. It's referenced frequently. Is that what you indicated?
On a daily basis for investigating customer complaints, investigating no-shows, investigating accidents, driver performance. Yeah, it's part of our audit process, in fact.
Okay, thank you.
And Madam Chair, members, it really adds to the efficiency of the service to really quickly be able to, if we have a complaint, resolve the complaint rather than having different opinions on how that is. And so the outcome of the investigation doesn't necessarily mean the customer was there was an issue, but the customer may have complained and investigated.
And maybe one last follow-up on it. Do our customers know that, is there signage that indicates?
Madam Chair, members, yes, they do know. They know to request that, and there's actually multiple cameras on there, and it's very clear. I think we state that in all of our materials that we do have this for their safety and protection too.
Great. Member Mike.
Madam Chair, Nick, I understand that the charge is to improve efficiency and expand service. To help me better understand the rest of the presentation, are we talking about a revenue neutral plan here?
Madam Chair, Council Member, I would guess the charge of the legislature was to reduce costs. The task force initially right away said, we're not here to cut service. We are here to provide better service, and it may cost more. I would think if we fully implemented this, maybe our cost growth would be a little slower or lower than if we didn't. But I do not believe the task force believes that this would reduce costs from what we are today. This may change the growth of costs. And they had task force members had no interest in cutting service. Their interest is in providing better and more service in their recommendation.
Great, thank you.
So I provided, that table was really some options we could provide, and we can start working on that without any legislative change. There's another option that was explored. DHS was a task force member. We've been working with DHS for a few years to try to find a way to partner with them in a way that could reduce the state costs on this system. We know of our customers that there's anywhere from 30 to 50% of the customers are also DHS customers waivered services. Yeah. And when they pay their fare, half of that fare is federally reimbursed. We want to find an avenue. We don't know which of those customers are that. We in general aggregate, we have some sense about that. We feel that there's an opportunity if we could get some legislative changes that half of the trip cost we could become eligible for federal funding. So we don't feel this recommendation would change growth, would change how the service, but we might have to change the service for these type of customers in some subtle ways. The recommendation was really to try to bring in federal funds and reduce some of the state share in the system. Step one in that recommendation is the data we need from DHS or they would need from us is protected on both our side and their side by state law, and we're not allowed to share it between our two agencies. So a recommendation by the task force was that that legislation be changed to allow the minimum data sharing necessary to design a program that would allow us to possibly capture these federal funds. And then until that occurs, we feel there isn't a partnership that we can take advantage of this. But if we were to achieve that this legislative session, then we would start designing a program with DHS, and they've been very willing to do that. That would allow us to estimates through the task force was anywhere from $8 to $10 million of current state funds in the program could be replaced with federal funds per year. So it's a substantial opportunity here, but it's just very different than the service models also. So the report itself goes into quite detail about how we captured those costs, how they're calculated, what the opportunities and barriers are. But that is a recommendation of the task force also.
Member Chavez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Nick, a question about the challenge with data sharing. Are we talking about the concern about non-anonymous data, or are we talking about the possibility of just an absolute prohibition of data sharing, which can have some political issues wrapped around it?
Madam Chair, council member, this is customer level data.
Okay.
And we already have data on our customers, very detailed. And we have a name, address, location, disability.
Okay.
They have the same customer information. Well, they have their customer and whether or not they're in a waivered services program. We do not need to share health data, but we just have to link the customer is what we need to do. And so there's not many fields, and it's data already collected, but in both our case, it's protected data by law, and in their case, it's protected by law,
Okay.
and we can't share.
All right, thanks.
So, and we know this is a large hurdle to overcome. It's separate. It's a separate issue for mental mobility. It's protected data sharing is a challenge to get changes at legislative.
Madam Chair,
Member Chavez.
be thankful you're not dealing with this in the EU, but I'm wondering if there's anybody there that does this type of service that has solved that nut that we could leverage.
Madam Chair, members, I'd be happy to go to Europe. And it is a state law that is protecting the data.
I know.
And so we're open to any ideas about that, but that has not come up, I guess, as an option. We know the data that we need on both sides. We just aren't allowed to share it.
Thank you.
So now to the recommendations. There's two sets of recommendations here, some that are to the council and then some that are to the legislature. First, they recommended that we pilot expansion of our services by the first quarter of 2019. And this is an opt-in on-demand service, either with taxis and TNCs and STS, both either the shared ride if it's available or the premium service. And so we don't believe there's any legislative law changes needed to design that. We do not know if these groups, when we got into negotiations, if they commit to that, but we believe we can start working with these providers to see if there'd be an agreement to provide these services. So nothing is stopping us from doing that from a legislative standpoint. We'd want council support, of course, to move into that, and we have not had, I believe because they are members of the task force, these industries would be interested in meeting at least, but the devil will be in the details about what our requirements would be, what they'd be willing to provide. So that's a recommendation that went to the council.
Can I clarify one thing? If you could just go back one slide. So if a rider would select a premium ride, like a taxi, would that be at their regular Metmo rate, or would they pay a premium fare?
Madam Chair, members, I guess our current taxi rate is they pay the first $5, we pay the next $15, and any cost over that $20, the rider pays. And so we probably start off with that service model. It does seem to work well and make sense. But the exact how we split, we'd be open to different fare structures. The premium, we are not bound by any federal laws on what the rates can be. Our fare on Metro Mobility is bound by law that it cannot be more than 2 times the base rate of fixed route. But on premium, we have different options. So I think we'd want to design the fare that would be reasonable for the rider, but have the right incentive mix also in there that would both attract the riders to use it, but the industry to also provide the rides. Our lessons learned from the taxi service is that the customers who use that service rarely, if ever, exceed a fare of $20 because they know that then they have to pay more than $5. And for many of our riders on Metro Mobility, even $5 is a large cost to them. But we have some flexibility in that fare structure.
Thank you.
So recommendations they made, first ones to the legislature around the system that provides options is fund the recommendations of this study. They recognize that funding is a challenge and that there might be cost. We're concerned about this multiple services, and one of the task force recommendations is that maybe there's a centralized reservation system of something where customer asks for a service and the reservation system matches them with the right service based on their needs, their trip, their capabilities, or their disability. The task force wasn't able to spend a lot of time on this, but they clearly saw that there's potential need for a reservation type system to simplify the system for customers and manage the risk so that the customer doesn't get put on the wrong type of service for what their capabilities are. So that we expect that would have a cost. And so one of the recommendations would be to fund a system like that. Our current scheduling system has been working with Uber and Lyft, and it already works with the taxis. And so there's an opportunity that this year our software that we currently use might be able to integrate with those systems that could kind of meet this task force recommendation. Some of the providers, the next one is really about the fleet that is available. There were some of the providers in the industry that said, we do not have accessible vehicles, and we will not provide accessible vehicles because the economics don't work for our business. And then some of them said, we have a limited number of accessible vehicles, but if we were to take on a lot of this service, we might not have enough accessible vehicles. And pretty much to a T, they all said we need some incentive to expand our fleet of accessible vehicles. And so the task force recommended that the legislature create some program or funding option that would expand the fleet of accessible vehicles if they're to do this pilot. They did not, for any time they mentioned funding, there was no actual number recommendation. It was just more of a general recommendation. Other recommendations for the council, work with this DHS county model. We've been working with them, but continue to, if we get the legislative change with the target goal of possibly implementation in 2020. We know there's a lot of work, but if we can get that data sharing to step one, then we can proceed on that schedule. This last bullet is one that the map becomes important. So on the map, we have our 2 areas. We have the ADA area, which is the lighter blue, and then the darker blue area is the non-ADA service. And what the difference is the light blue is under FTA requirements, guided by where our fixed route service is. So that's a less flexible option for what we can do there. We are under federal requirements. The darker blue is what is required by the state since 2006. It says you will provide basically Metro Mobility service within these boundaries. And if you call back to 2006, if you're at all in the transit world at that point, that is the transit taxing district boundary in 2006. Legislature passed basically, that was a time that we were going through budget challenges similar to now. And there was a consideration for scaling back metro mobility services. And so the legislature said, boundaries are fixed at this for in 2006 going forward. And so that darker blue area is where this last bullet is. We have quite a bit of flexibility in what our service options are in that. For example, one extreme would be the task force did not recommend this, but you could have that whole dark blue area just provided by taxis and STS and TNCs as a recommendation. We're not, task force didn't go that far, but they're saying if you do not get sufficient budget, this is an area that you could, task force would recommend that you have more flexibility there than you do in the light blue area, which is really guided by where our fixed route is. So you can experiment, you can do different types of pilots in that area, not just to cut costs, but also to try different service models that may work. That might be an area. So that's what that bullet pertains to. In terms of funding sources for the legislature, they clearly saw this potential with DHS, but they felt it is in the legislature's hands to give us the flexibility to pursue that. And there could be further laws that are required besides the data sharing after we get that. They either fund a study into that, the DHS model, it's an expertise that is complex on the federal requirements, and so maybe provide some funding to help us get into the details on that was a recommendation that they made. And then for meeting the requirements, they had a couple of recommendations both for the council and the legislature. They recognize that if we were to implement all these services, this is a really complex thing we'd be introducing to our customers. And so make sure that we provide sufficient public information, outreach, marketing to explain this so that we manage our risks and then really get them to use the right service that we implement. And we wholeheartedly agree with that. And then really continue to do our analysis of what is the driver wages, and Christine will talk about some of the impacts of that wage increase that we had, but really how is performance and drivers and this market tied together, continue to analyze that. And the last bullet is really kind of where that task force started, is that this is an essential service for the region. It's funded by the state. The state needs to fund and dedicate funding source for metro mobility. And ideally what it is a separate source for this program, so that as the cost of metro mobility grows, it's not impacting our regular transit also. And so their recommendation, a strong recommendation that really make sure that as a legislature, this is a state responsibility that's so sufficiently funded, but it's needed today and its growth in the future. So those are the general task force findings. The report was submitted. It's available online with all the information that was presented at the council. It was, I don't know if I said this before, but they did take a vote on it on the last meeting. It was unanimously supported, the recommendations. And if you looked at that task force, that there's a diverse set of opinions and backgrounds, and they unanimously supported the recommendations going forward to the legislature. So if I can answer questions on the task force, or Christine can talk about some of the other changes we're doing before we open it up for more questions.
Any questions or comments, Member Reynoso?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So Nick, I guess I'm trying to grasp the procedure here. So these are recommendations to the Metropolitan Council. Is there going to be an opportunity for the council to weigh in and decide what we want to accept or what we want to take on as recommendations and take action on those individual items? Or are we in a situation where the legislature is going to legislate on how we run a specific service that we have?
Madam Chair, Council Member, I'm not exactly sure on that. We would, obviously there's an opportunity for these council recommendations to weigh in, but because this was created by the legislature and then submitted to the legislature fairly late in the process, I do not know what will happen necessarily in terms of if there will be any bills introduced or any legislative action this year on moving forward on what was recommended to them, or if the legislature would weigh in on the recommendations for the council. I can say at the presentation today, we were at the House committee where this bill started last year. And they asked questions about the report, but didn't really talk about next steps at that point. So I'm not exactly sure. I believe this data sharing with DHS seems to have some interest, but that's as far as they got at this point.
And the reason I ask is because there's some things in here that I have grave concerns about, specifically a company telling us how they're going to operate and basically saying that we're not going to comply with any background checks. I think we have a responsibility to our customers to make sure that we know who's driving them around, and we make sure that they have sufficient liability coverage. But to have one of our, if we had a service provider, whether it's a NOC or another company that said we're not going to background check our workers, and that's final. We tell them to hit the road. In simple terms, if we had a company that said that you're not going to tell us how much insurance coverage we're going to have, we tell them go somewhere else. Then, if we had a company that said that we weren't going to random drug test our employees, regardless of what you say, we wouldn't do business with them. And to me, when you look at the TNCs, that's what they're saying. And to me, there's no way we should ever consider, as long as those companies don't do background checks and drug tests and have specific training for their drivers, there's no way we should put any of our customers in that situation. And I'm adamantly opposed to that. So.
Thank you, Member Reynoso. Any other questions or comments? Member Munt.
Madam Chair, Nick, my takeaway from this is that this is making an already complex system even more complex, and I just hope that before we would move forward on any of this, that we really explore what the unintended consequences might be. I'm also concerned about creating a two-tiered ADA service in the blue areas of the transit taxing district. Part of my district is in the light blue, part of it's in the dark blue. I've got real problems if people in my district are receiving two different levels of service.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Member Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In my district, it's worse than that. I have a city that is in the transit taxing district but has no ADA service because it joined after 2006. So there's a whole host of issues as you look around the region. I guess I was really disappointed to hear that the Uber, Lyft sort of people didn't want to make an enhancement that would protect our more vulnerable customers. I had been kind of excited about this whole process because I thought maybe we could have a better way. But if they're not willing to change to adapt to customer needs, that I am afraid to. People can choose to use those ride services and do all the time, but if it's under the guise of being handicap accessible, that really scares me. My husband is disabled, and because there's no ADA service, when he was going to Courage Center, he had taxi drivers that would take him every day and back, and he got to know them, and they were nice, but then he had to go to HCMC for a test, and the drop-off went fine, but he didn't do well in the test, and ended up, the HCMC people left him on the sidewalk, and he was laying on the sidewalk, unable to move, and there was no recourse for that because he's not entitled to have somebody pick him up at the door and make sure that he's safe. And I don't want that to happen to any of our customers. So if the Uber and Lyft people aren't willing to adapt to whatever our customers' needs are, it's just not safe.
Thank you. Member Chavez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to try and pile on with comments, suggestion for when the conversation resumes with the legislators. My recommendation is to have a bunch of wheelchairs there and have everybody sit in the wheelchairs, then have the cab come up and say, okay, everybody file in. And just to see the logistics of how challenging that's going to be. I think the reality for us is that our reality is changing with regard to Uber and Lyft and those types of providers. The challenge for them, if you just think about if any of us were going to be an individual driver, we don't have the money to go get an ADA compatible vehicle. We've got what we've got. So that's an issue that is going to have to get solved somehow, and that takes money. As far as the liability insurance, that can be solved in 15 minutes with some creative policies and all that kind of stuff, and you insure the drivers. I mean, that's no big deal. No background checks, I agree, that's a non-starter. I mean, that's just a function of, I think, Uber, Lyft saying, well, we don't want to spend the money for that. Okay, well, then it's going to get transferred to the drivers. Okay, well, we can cover that cost. It's not $1 billion to do that. The issue is the capital for the vehicles, and then also the culture as far as get in a wheelchair.
Nick, did you want to respond?
Madam Chair, I may have misspoken, or maybe there is background checks provided by the TNC. They're not willing to meet the standards that we do with fingerprint background checks, and then of course it's background checks that they're managing, and so we don't have oversight necessarily over that process. But I didn't want you to leave with the impression that there's no background checks, but it's at a lower level than we currently require.
Worthless.
Member Millander?
Go ahead, Eddie.
Madam Chair, and Nick, I appreciate you putting that in there, but any of us could go on to the internet, sign up for Uber or Lyft, send them a picture ID, and nobody ever checks to verify that I'm the actual driver. That's their verification system. So it isn't where they have to go to an office and get their ID verified. So to me, that's nonsense. I mean, that's just a non-starter. Without a fingerprint background check that matches the person with that ID, it's useless.
Member Millander?
So just to, Nick, to clarify, at least to me, and I think Eddie asked you the question, but so you're reporting to us an event that happened that was recommended during the session last year. I mean, so you're really not clear what the action is, what the expectation is from here. I mean, is that what I'm hearing?
Madam Chair, members, yes, this is a task force that was really, in a sense, outside of the council, was legislatively required, and they were required to report to the legislature. But it is a service that to implement any of the recommendations that is our responsibility as program manager to do that.
Okay, now I missed the last part of that. I'm sorry.
It would be our responsibility as the manager of the Metro Mobility Program to implement recommendations so the council clearly has a role, but the task force itself was essentially reporting to the legislature.
So there isn't any action that they're asking us. You're just reporting to us, and we could assume that if in fact the conversation continues, that there'll be a venue up there to raise the issues, and then I would assume Judd and others will come back and bring those issues to us.
Correct. And the way they laid out their recommendations, they said, here's some recommendations that require legislative action. Here's some recommendations that the council can take without legislative action. They didn't say you must, or there wasn't any, they're a task force making recommendations.
And just by the way, as the informational piece, Uber lost $4 billion last year.
How many? Billion or million?
Billion.
Oh. So that goes back to, just to clarify, your basically slide 12 or the task force recommendations for the council. And then 13 was the recommendations for the legislature. Okay. And then, 14 for the council. Sorry, they're kind of...
They created different areas like efficiency requirements, and then they had some recommendations for council, some for legislature by those headings.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Great. Well, I mean, I do think it makes, Member Dorfman, did you have a comment?
Well, I just want to, when you're looking at proposed growth in ridership, I assume we're factoring in the really significant growth in the senior population in the metro area, which is just exploding over the next 10, 15 years.
Madam Chair, members, yeah, that growth that we did analysis is really big drivers. We're growing as a region, and so both in demographically getting older, which is a large share of our customers, but just the share of disability, those with disabilities is proportional to the population size. And as our population is growing, so is that our customer base there. And it's sustained growth for a long time, I believe.
Member Munn.
Madam Chair, Nick, I'm curious what the lawmakers' response was when you presented this at the legislature. Specifically, if they raised any of the concerns that you've heard here about exposing our clients to Uber and Lyft and the liability and the security issues.
Madam Chair, members, they asked questions about it. I don't necessarily, as they probably weren't I didn't sense as much concern, but and it could have just been a factor of time. One of the task force members, Ken Rogers, who's on our TAAC and has a disability, he spoke after me, and he spoke specifically about there's risks here, and this is challenges that you must recognize as a legislature, and so I believe they heard that message from him also, and so.
Member Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I could share some of the concerns of my colleagues, and I'm not sure what we would gain. I understand the current contracting with the taxis for the premium service makes a lot of sense because we're making sure we're vetting them, we're doing background checks, we have some control there. But with the Uber and Lyft, especially if it's a centralized service, you're losing that advantage that they've created in the marketplace with their, being able to get it on demand on the phones. So that you wouldn't have that. They wouldn't be providing the same safety, insurance, et cetera, that we have with the taxis. So why have it as part of our system? I mean, a customer can go out and get that right now. We're not preventing them from having that. So I don't understand what we would gain and what we would be providing to our customers by doing this.
Madam Chair, council members, there's a couple of things. Is that sometimes the taxi capacity today, they do deny rides certain days, and so I think we expand the amount of available fleet options. So that's one possibility, particularly on bad weather days. There's a request that we don't serve a lot of the taxi rides on theirs, I think. And maybe some of the service, because when you have more options available, it might be quicker response. There's a few of those. But we would be, in order to make this work and for us to pay portion of the fare, they would have to give up some of the advantages that they have today. We think there would have to be some way that we can invoice and make payments and assure the trips were valid. And we have in taxi today that we have to say, yes, that person is eligible to ride that taxi. It can't just be anybody that seeks reimbursement. So, we'd be forced to make their systems less efficient than they are for any of us on the street today because of the requirements. And so, it's definitely different.
Thank you. Member Reynoso.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize that I don't mean to dominate this conversation, but this is an issue that is near and dear to me because, I've seen the devastation of the taxi industry with both Uber and Lyft. I'm curious, Nick, whether the conversation of surge pricing came up, because that's certainly something that when the ridership is high, the surging prices of Uber and Lyft would really hurt some of these people that are going to be on that fixed fare. And if they take one of these services and with the notion or thought that it's going to be a $20 ride and all of a sudden it's an $80 ride, were there any conversations of the surge pricing?
Madam Chair, council member, they did discuss a little bit about that. I think the industry providers and that said they would continue to have, they wouldn't change their business model, and surge pricing would still be part of that. So that's another, again, a risk that could be borne in that option. So the customers, though, do know the fare before they have to commit to it in general. And so there's some feedback there on that.
it was discussed as well in that context of the robust information campaigns about the options and what it really means to an individual customer. In the detail of the report, it does go into some customer profiles of the kinds of customers that may be advantaged or disadvantaged by the various service options. And I think it's important to note that this TNC option that we're kind of spending some time on is really comparable in structure to the premium taxi option. I don't foresee it changing much except for the requirement. I don't see the requirements to deliver that service changing much. If the TNCs can't meet those requirements, they wouldn't be able to get the contract. We have a good contractor now that can meet our requirements. But there are other models that the task force report does also talk about, that shared ride model, the STS models, and I think there are some opportunities there to offer service alternatives and expand service options and maybe meet 100% of our demand. Right now we are denying rides in the non-ADA service area by 2%, and we've seen as Nick described, just the ability to hire and retrain drivers, hire and retain drivers is allowing us to maybe meet more ridership demand. So as a region, we want to look at alternatives that would meet the demand for transportation. Something we haven't really talked about yet too, but if I could just add, I think the premium offers not being public transit, there's a shared ride model in there too that we want to offer and or consider piloting or think about what the market can bear, because single ride occupancy vehicles is not the direction to go in, and there's a lot of articles about how the TNCs are congesting cities, et cetera. So really looking at a shared ride option as preferred or available to customers is something I'm interested in.
But at the end of the day, Madam Chair, but at the end of the day, we would never allow somebody that's going to provide a service to us to dictate what the rules of engagement are going to be.
In my mind,
that's
we're
unacceptable.
looking at contractual requirements and vetting those again in a competitive process.
Yeah, we would enter agreements before we'd be any reimbursement or put any of our customers on.
I think, are there other comments or questions? I think this has been a really useful discussion. I think looking at the overall cost of paratransit across all of the peer regions in that early slide, I think really highlights the challenge that we, as well as other regions across the country, face in providing paratransit service. The other slide that I felt was very compelling was just the percentage increase in demand that we're expecting for this service. When you look at the requirements that we have from a cash flow perspective, when you look at our waterfall of the money coming in and what we're required to spend, it has to go to Metro Mobility. It has to go to funding 50% of our existing light rail service. And so what ends up at the bottom of that waterfall is our regular route bus service. And so as we're looking at significant increases in demand and cost for Metro Mobility, this is, I think, a serious concern for our ability to provide good transit service overall, just kind of projecting future budget concerns. I think it's really good to have this conversation and to really get feedback in this forum, as well as at the legislature, for thinking about how we expand service and expand or at least enhance the customer experience, which I think I appreciated your last comments there of if we are denying rides and if there are options to enhance mobility for folks that have challenges with mobility, then that's, I think, a net positive for us. But at the same time, there are numerous considerations for how we provide those services. So thank you for that presentation. I know you have a couple more slides, so I don't know if you want to.
So now we want to just transition to a few other things that are changing with the program that are outside of the task force. We thought you'd be of interest in giving an update on the impact of the wage increase and the results we've seen to date. So
Right. The $2 an hour minimum driver wage increase that was approved effective October 1st has seen some pretty good early indicating results. Our transit team provider, the provider that provides the most rides in our system, in January 1st to October 1st of 2017, they had a turnover ratio of 42% and a retention rate of only 36%. Since October until yesterday, when I received the data, they now have a turnover ratio that's down to 10% and a retention rate that's up to 67%. They've been able to hire more drivers since October 2017 than they did in all of 2016. Overall, customer complaints are down. They attribute that to the ability to retain and ongoing train their drivers. So that's, I think, really significant. Their customer complaints have decreased 32% since October 1st. Similar story at First Transit South, our Burnsville provider. They've specifically seen an improved retention at the 30-day employment mark. And our First Transit East provider is reporting significant increases in hiring rates and the ability to fill classes. They don't yet have the retention rate data that suggests a big improvement, but they suggest it's too early to track that. So this is something that I'm working with the providers to receive monthly reports on, so that per the task force recommendation, we can track the appropriate market rate for driver hiring and examine this issue as we move along. Another thing that we've instituted beginning in December of 2017 was to try to initiate an incentive for grouping of rides of 5 or more in our off-peak. This is to basically incentivize customers to maybe if they're living in an apartment complex or a group home and they might be going to Target or somewhere at different times than their neighbor, but maybe on the same day, maybe we can incentivize grouping those rides together, and we'll give them a return ride free if they do that. Nick mentioned earlier that with the premium same-day system, we've changed model a little bit in that on February 1st, we've allowed premium same-day taxi rides to be booked in advance. It had been just premium same-day. So with that came a name change to the program, and we now call that premium on demand. And it was a soft launch. We told customers about it for the first time in a newsletter 2 weeks ago. It was mentioned and highlighted on our website for the first time last week when we initiated a new website for Metro Mobility. And already 17 people in the last week have booked a premium ride in advance. So it's really just to provide a similar option to book a taxi in advance and not just same day for customers that want to do that. We are working with Metro Transit to pilot an initiative that would incentivize a fixed route transfer for customers. The concept is there'd be a free ride or reduced ride on Metro Mobility if part of that trip is transferring to the fixed route. So yesterday was our kickoff of the implementation team for that. We're targeting second quarter of this year to do that, looking at initially Brooklyn Center Transit Center and Maplewood Mall as good opportunities to get customers, Metro Mobility customers, familiar to transfer to fixed route in those locations and complete their trip. There's a small pilot that we're looking to initiate, have not yet initiated, but it's in progress, discussions with a large day training and rehabilitation center to lease buses, subsidize a lease of buses. And the concept there is that they can use that subsidy to expand some of the service they provide from their agency for maybe midday trips and maybe trips that would otherwise be booked on Metro Mobility to see if that has any impact. But the idea is to relieve some pressure on the capital resources that we have for our fleet requirement. So next steps, here's just a slide to talk about some of the communication strategy around this. You know, there's a lot of unknowns, right, about what we're going to be required to do when the legislature deliberates on this, but we are getting a lot of questions. You made the presentation yesterday. Obviously, today I went to the Minnesota Council on Transportation Access and delivered a presentation. Born from that was a request for me to present it to Dakota County, the task force report. That'll be Friday. TAC obviously will be next week. We'll bring this to our community at our conversation in April. I've given information to my staff because as this hits the street and maybe has some media interest, our staff are going to start fielding questions. And so we're mindful of the need to really develop a communication strategy around this report. As far as a work plan for staff and to be responsive to the recommendations in the report, we are excited about some technology improvements that Trapeze is demonstrating for us with our version upgrade in May. There is, along with an online booking, a trip broker piece of that software that, because they do have a partnership with Lyft, not yet Uber, but Lyft, they are integrated with the Lyft application. And so a ride booked by Metro Mobility would and if we have a partnership with Lyft, for example, would conceivably show up on the customer's use. The Lyft ride would show up in the Trapeze system. So there are some partnerships within the industry that get to the data sharing concern, and that Trapeze and Lyft already have signed agreements. Mentioned improved customer communications. That was a recommendation that we really need to develop a robust strategy around our service options, including what I think right now is our taxi system. I don't know that there's a large comprehensive understanding of our customer base about what that program really is and what it provides. So the webpage provides us a platform to do that. And so we'd conceive that we'd use similar profiles of any service models that we approach. We are going to reach out to the TNC companies and initiate some exploratory meetings, find out exactly the devil in the details as far as what product they would be willing to bring to the Twin Cities market. They do have an accessible fleet product in other cities. They don't yet have it in the Twin Cities. They do have a shared model or shared ride product in other cities. They don't yet have in the Twin Cities. So Nick mentioned that they did indicate interest or willingness to examine that. So having some of those conversations about what they would be able to do, what are their concerns on the background check. Right now, it's fingerprinting, as I understand it, is the concern. What kind of training programs would they be willing to initiate or specialize if they went into contract with us? Those kinds of meetings. And then to meet the recommendation about driver training and some of the customer experiences and the driver turnover issue and augmenting driver training. We're partnering with some advocacy groups. I went with ARC a couple weeks ago in a meeting 3 days ago with the National Federation for the Blind. We talked about partnering on some development of some training materials that would help supplement the disability awareness training that's already been being provided by our contractors. So we are being creative, I think, with some partnerships and advocacy groups as well.
Great. Well, I think this was a really great discussion that we've had, and I think that you've probably heard some feedback from our members that we should be thinking about the way in which we respond to the task force recommendations as the council, especially as we are ultimately responsible and accountable for providing those services in the region. Mm-hmm. Member Millander.
So Chair, if that's the case, and I'm not sure that, and maybe someone can clarify if we, and I agree, we need to have a response, but as usual, I think it needs to be thoughtful. Obviously, there's some concerns. The legislature was, I think, concerned enough by some of the questions or issues that we raised last year in regards to funding. So, I mean, do we have a period of time when we can kind of digest this amongst ourselves so that we can go back and take a look at the good things that they talked about, but also the real concerns? So, I mean, is there a time period that maybe it can be an issue at one of the committees of the whole that we might be able to, so I think there's a lot of good things, but also obviously some concerns, and as we always do, I think we need to have a real well vetted but also thoughtful response back to the legislature on the work that they've done. So, I mean, can we do that? I would assume.
I think so. I think we could definitely
I think that might
take
be
it
a
up.
good way to really kind of flush the thing out a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be, not that anyone's asking me, but if they did, that's what my response
Well,
would
you are the vice chair, so.
Yeah.
Great, so that's, I think, really good feedback. Any member Munt?
Madam Chair, before we close, I just want to thank Christine. The most common concern that I hear from my constituents is about the shortcomings of Metro Mobility. And whenever I bring those issues to Christine or to Andy Streetsig or to Nick, our riders are treated with respect, and you always find solutions in an environment where solutions are really hard to come by without more funding. So I thank you for taking the heat. I thank you for finding the solutions. And I thank you for respecting all of our customers.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, well said.
One last thing.
Oh, Member Herdosa.
I promise this is the last thing. First of all, thank you. But there was something I caught when you said you plan on meeting with the TNCs to see what they're willing to do. To me, from a perspective of negotiations, I don't think that's the angle we should take. We need to tell them what they need to do. And if they're not willing to do it, then the question of using them is off. I don't think for us to go and ask them what they're willing to do and end up with a couple small things and call it a day is sufficient. So I think it's been loud and clear by many of my colleagues that anything short of a fingerprint background check and liability it's a non-starter.
Madam Chair, Council Member, I think that's an excellent point, and thank you for bringing it up. What I meant by that, from a market perspective, they've made some mention, both the TNCs made some mention at the task force that this market is just not viable for them to bring those extra service models, and yet they would potentially consider it if there were to be some relationship with the council to provide this service. And it doesn't, I framed it as an exploratory meeting simply to find out more information about what their appetite is in this market, even to have our time spent on more substantive meetings with them. I think that right now we have a taxi model that meets the needs. What else is out there to supplement?
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is reports from council members. Any reports from council members? General counsel?
Oh, yes, Madam Chair, council members, I actually have a report today. Yesterday, Judge Thunheim denied Lakes and Parks Alliance's motion for summary judgment and granted the council's motion for summary judgment. That means that environmental lawsuit against the council has been dismissed, and we can proceed without it. The court specifically found that the council's municipal consent process and our memorandum of understanding with St. Louis Park in Minneapolis did not irreversibly and irretrievably commit the council to a single alternative in violation of federal law, and recognized that the challenge the council has in balancing the municipal consent process under state law and federal environmental review law, but we successfully navigated those challenges, so that case has been dismissed.
Thank you. Member Dorfman.
Thank you. That was good news. It's kind of been a long time in coming to hear from Judge Thunheim. So what's the process if they choose to appeal?
If they choose to appeal, it would go to the 8th Circuit, and they would brief their appeal, and the council would also have the opportunity at that time to raise any appellate issues it would like to raise, and it would take a long time for that case to wind its way through.
Okay, thank you.
Other reports or questions? Regional Administrator?
Yes, I'd like to just mention to the council, Beth Reitz has left the room this evening, but I still want to acknowledge that this is Beth's last week at the council. And I just want to say that I've had an opportunity to work with Beth pretty closely in my few years as regional administrator, and she's so knowledgeable and intelligent, and she's not territorial. She's given opportunities for her staff to take leadership roles. But most of all, what I've appreciated about Beth is that she is what you see as a council members with me. She's optimistic. She always has a solution for things. And I'm going to miss her very much, and the council, I think, is going to miss her very much. So Her last day is tomorrow. I think there's an event here at 1 o'clock. I think maybe another event later in the evening.
It's 2 o'clock.
At 2 o'clock? Thank you for that correction. And I just want to acknowledge her to the council because she's been a great employee and a great servant to the region.
Thank you for that. I would echo your comments. We're going to really miss Beth and her contribution to the council and her wonderful demeanor. I feel like she is always very upbeat, and it's an incredibly important role when you think about the work of the council. It kind of brings together all of the different functional elements of the council and really works closely with all of our partner agencies. So it's really important to have somebody as good as Beth in that role. My quick update is obviously everyone knows session began on February 20th, and we're already off to the races in terms of responding to requests and seeing some legislation proposals moving forward. And I think that's it. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and seconded. It's not